So
just hold on. Just gonna admit everyone in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the Zoom session. Before I formally start, I just want to get everyone in, get the technical stuff in before I hand it over to my host, Shaheen. And we're really privileged to have Dr. Irfan with us here all the way from Germany. So just give a few minutes as I admit everyone, and we'll make a formal start in the next 1 or 2 minutes or so. I'm just waiting for people to come in. Cool. It is being recorded, so bear in mind. So if you haven't registered, you will get a, please leave your email address here. This is the session for, it's a book review session on religion as critique, Islamic critical thinking from MECCA to marketplace, and honored and privileged to have Dr. Irfan Ahmad from the Max Planck's Institute for the Study of Religions and Ethnic Diversity, and it's hosted by Dr. Shaheen. So we're going to start very shortly. Just some housekeeping rules, brothers and sisters, if you don't mind. As you come in, you are muted automatically. But if you do have your phones or your devices switched on, please put them on mute, number one. If you haven't registered already, you will please leave your email address on the chat, and you'll get a copy of the recording. And thirdly, there is a Q&A session. So if you do have questions, write them down on the chat, and we'll try, and Shaheen will try and get them answered during the Q&A session as well. So it's very important. Please, if you don't mind, adhere to. Right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to the Zoom session Islamic Courses book review titled Religion as Critique, Islamic Critical Thinking from MECCA to Marketplace, with the author, Dr. Irfan Ahmad from the Max Planck Institute for Study of Religion, Religious and Ethnic Diversity, who's now calling us from Germany. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Irfan.
Assalamu alaikum.
Islam, rahmatullah. Thank you so much. We're really honored and grateful that you are taking time out to talk about your book and your thoughts and ideas. And we also have Shaheen Moidunny from Leeds. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Thank you, Mizan. Yeah.
And he's our host, and I'm going to hand it over to him without further ado. Very quickly, can I just remind everyone, if you are just coming in, please keep your phones or PCs on mute. It's being recorded. Leave your email address if you haven't done it already, and there is a Q&A session. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our dear friend Shaheen. Bismillah.
Thank you, Thank you, Mizan. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and I also welcome you all to the Islamic Courses discussion on religious critique. And we have Professor Irfan Ahmad. Professor Irfan Ahmad is, for those who do not know, I'm sure most of you know him, but still, is a political anthropologist and a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. His 2010 book, that's his first book, Islamism and Democracy in India, The Transformation of Jamaat Islami, was shortlisted for the 2011 ICA's Book Prize for Best Study in the Field of Social Sciences. He also recently, his recent book, that is, which he co-edited, The Algebra of Warfare, Welfare, A Long View of India's 2014 Election by Oxford University Press. And he's also the author of 2 monographs on Indian politics and religion. And there's an upcoming book to be released this year. It's called Our Anthropology and Ethnography Equivalent. He's also taught in universities for a long time in Australia and Netherlands. Now he's in Germany. And apart from this, he's also on the editorial board of South Asia and Public Anthropologist, an academic journal. He writes regularly for newspapers and articles, and he comments on contemporary issues, especially in state of affairs of Muslims in India. He's been widely interviewed by mainstream media as well. Now, the book we have today on discussion is his 2007 seminal work, Religion as Critique, Islamic Critical Thinking from Mecca to the Marketplace. This book has been widely discussed and has been translated also into various languages. I understand it is being translated now to Arabic as well. For me, this is a book, when it was announced, which I was very eagerly waiting for, and I think I got it right off the shelves. It's a fascinating read. which through a series of sophisticated arguments, Professor Ahmad establishes Islam as an agent of critique. And in doing so, it makes us to reconsider ideas of our notions or contemporary notions of modernity and change, and tackles issues ranging from nationhood and state, democracy and secularism to women's equality. So I would invite Professor Irfan officially to speak on part of the book, inshallah.
Okay, so Assalamu alaikum to everyone, and I thank Islamic Courses for this invitation. In particular, I'm thankful to Mizan for organizing this event and to Shaheen for chairing this meeting. And of course, I'm thankful to all the participants who are probably in different time zones and in different countries. And I look forward to their reflections. Is it audible, Mizan?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect, yes.
Okay, and the slides are in place?
Yes, the slides are in place. When you're ready to go, just let me know.
So I think you should put the first one now. And but it looks like I can't shorten this. Mizan?
Yes, go ahead, yeah.
I had some of my notes, but I can't look at my screen.
Right, okay, so slide with the notes, yeah?
No, but I have not shared the notes with you. It is on my computer, but this doesn't allow me to access the notes.
On your computer?
Yes.
Okay, so something on your computer. I've just got the slides, that's it. Notes. I'm not sure if there are no notes. No, I can't see any notes on the slides.
No, I cannot, from my computer, I cannot reduce and access my desktop, for example.
Oh, I see. Okay, so then I'll probably have to stop sharing though. That's the thing.
Or maybe you can share with all the participants if there is a function like that and not share with me.
That's going to be a bit difficult because just to avoid any hackers, I've removed the function for sharing screen for everyone else. That's the reason why. What would you prefer?
Well, if then maybe I think you can okay, then let it be. I think it is all right.
It should be all right. Okay.
Yeah. Keep as it is.
Okay, fine.
Okay. So one of the things, we live in a very strange time, the lockdown. It also had many positive function. I discovered that I could work well part-time as a halaq. And I don't mean while halaq, I mean the barber. I did my own hair cutting, and I can tell you that it is so bad. But anyway, this is one of the things about lockdown. So I want to begin by saying something about religion as critique, as a text. So it is a sort of unusual book. And I recall having a suggestive discussion with my editor about the potential reviewers. Should it be anthropologist, Enlightenment specialist, political theorist, South Asianist, historians, literary scholars? And I told her that probably someone who is all of them at one time. But in the era of specialization that we live in, it is not very easy to find such a person. Having said that, I should also make a qualification that while I engage with all these disciplines and subdiscipline, and anthropological sensibility informs my take on all these disciplines. Before I proceed, let me also make it clear at the outset that the dictionary meaning of naqd, which is roughly rendered as critique in English, naqd in Arabic also means cash. So the general analytical meaning of naqd in Arabic, tanqid in Urdu, and intiqad in Farsi, it basically means to assess, to judge. In Urdu tradition, it is janchna and parakhna. And in its original meaning, it also has the connotation of distinguishing the fake coins from the original ones and vice versa. So that is the key to getting to the idea of critique. So as some of you know, the book has two parts. Part one is called formulation and part two is illustration. So from the very beginning of this project, it was very clear to me that I need to have my own theoretical formulation rather than simply choose an existing one and apply it, if at all there is such a theory suitable to this book. So it is not possible to get into the specifics of the book. So in the remaining 18 minutes or so, what I will do is to give an outline of the general and theoretical parameters of the book. And some of these specific things can be probably discussed during Q&A. And I will end with the 4 theses that the book advances. Next slide. So if Immanuel Kant was the Papa Enlightenment subject, Edward Said was a loyal child of that Enlightenment. Credited with coining the term secular criticism, Edward Said also viewed himself as a secular critic. Notably, he titled the introduction and conclusion to his book, The World, the Text, and the Critic, respectively as Secular Criticism and Religious Criticism, and lamenting that critics had become clerics. Edward Said invoked the Enlightenment for critique to become a truly secular enterprise. So in formulation like Edward Said, critique was purely a secular exercise. Unlike Said, Peter Sloterdijk, the famous German philosopher, considers critique as an illusion. And yet, there is at least one shared ground between Edward Said and Sloterdijk. Both disregard the critical voice of religion. For Sloterdijk, and I quote him, "Whoever has health insurance needs God only half as much as before, but whoever has life insurance doesn't need God at all." End of quote. So for long, Western Enlightenment has been viewed as a break with religion and heralding the era of critique and reason. Some caution against the use of definite article before Enlightenment, suggesting that Enlightenment was diverse in British, Dutch, German, French, Scottish context. However, this qualification or caution has not dislodged the prevalent reading of the Enlightenment. In writing this book, my principal aim was to examine the dominant view of the Enlightenment as a rupture from religion and inaugurator of reason. The Enlightenment, I argue, did not oppose Christianity. On the contrary, it re-inscribed Christianity. Next slide. So Immanuel Kant took Protestant Christianity as already rational to criticize other religions. In the preface to the first edition of Critique of Pure Reason, Kant outlined a challenge to rebuilding of metaphysics from nomads because philosophical nomadism did not offer a permanent residence, Wohnplatz in German. So in the second edition, he undertook its stabilization by instituting the proper boundaries. Nomads in Kant are boundary maker, and I quote, "The Arabs or Mongol nurtures contempt for the town dweller and deems himself noble in comparison with him, as wandering about in the desert with one's own horses and sheep is more entertainment than work," end of quote. Behind Kant's description of the Arab or Mongol as wandering about without working is his contrasting Protestant idea of hard work, which sets his philosophical nomadism apart from Arabs. And Kant staged this contrast to draw a boundary between rational, hardworking philosophers and irrational, enthusiastic mystagogues. To him, the danger to philosophy was at once a danger to reason and what he called Christian Europe. So this boundary drawing aimed to protect philosophy from the danger of enthusiastic visions. Mizan, just a second. I see a notice from you. Please move the window away. Is it meant for me or it is for the general audience?
No, it's just ignore that. Just ignore that.
Oh, okay. So this boundary drawing aimed to protect philosophy from the danger of enthusiastic vision. Kant took thinking as obverse of enthusiasm, and not to use reason was to open the gate to all enthusiasm, superstition, and even to atheism. The figure assigned with this twin danger, enthusiasm, fanaticism, and nomadism, was Islam and Prophet Muhammad. Kant described Muhammad as a zealot. In Critique of Practical Reason, this figure of Muhammad returns as a sign of unreason, nonsense, and madness of imagination. The Enlightenment in France was likewise Christian and anti-Islam. So consider, for example, Voltaire, who is regarded as an atheist and hostile to Christianity. However, Voltaire himself hated atheistic philosophy. This is not to say that he didn't criticize Christianity, he did. But Voltaire's reference point was not only reason, but also his notion of the true religion of Jesus. In contrast, Voltaire described Prophet Muhammad as an impostor and as a sign of fanaticism. Other French philosophers and encyclopedists, they also attacked Islam. Now, moving on from Europe to India. Next slide. The story of Indian liberalism is not that different from the European one. Historian Chris Bailey called Raja Ram Mohan Rai as the first Indian liberal. But Roy is known for his hostility to Islam and Muslims and love for colonialism. Roy was said to have seen Hindustan, and I quote, for several centuries subjected to Mohammedan rule and the civil and religious rights of its original inhabitants being constantly trampled upon, end of quote. So notice that to Rai, Hindus were original inhabitants and Muslims were outsiders. And this is how Raja Ram Mohan Rai welcomed colonialism. Quote, "Your dutiful subjects have not viewed the English as conquerors, but rather as deliverers, as a father and protector," end of quote. From the time of Rai until now, Hinduization of nation and externalization of Islam have gone hand in hand. The Indian version of Orientalism vis-a-vis Islam also operates in the academic field. So scholars like Ahmad Sen and Gayatri Spivak, they efface Islam and its tradition of reasoning and critique. If and when they do discuss Islam, they discuss Muslims statistically, not conceptually. And that is a big difference. So as I see it, the next slide, please. As I see it, Islam as critique can be studied neither by philosophy nor by anthropology alone. We need an anthropology of philosophy. Now, the key point to note here is that philosophy is not simply and only as a mental exercise. If we analyze philosophy from the prism of political anthropology, modern Western thoughts at large emerge also as a project of security. And Michael Dillon is right to say that Western political thought is impelled by its metaphysical ambition to secure necessary grounds in order to achieve the very security, which is at the same time metaphysical and political. In anthropology, ethnicity means cultural differences and the drawing of boundaries between two or more groups, often in the non-West. There is ample justification to shift the gaze to Europe to examine the operation of ethnicity in philosophy. And as shown earlier, for the so-called enlighteners in Europe as well as in India, Islam was an important other against which they fashioned their ideas about reason and critique. Best suited to criticize such ethnic mechanism of the Enlightenment, anthropologists, however, reproduce them. In titling their book, Debating Islam, Michael Fisher and Mehdi Abdi assume that Muslims debate, but they don't critique because the reference of debate remains revelation. So as they discuss the Quran, Hajj, Hadith in their book, their premise is that it does open the space for critique, but not critique qua critique. That is, Muslims in their book participate in hermeneutical enterprise, but not in epistemological critique. The reference point of which they again assume is solely the secular reason of the Enlightenment. And this is more evident in Anthropology as Cultural Critique, a book which Michael Fisher co-authored with George Marcus. Works by Del Eichelman, John Bowen, and Magnus Marsden on Morocco, Indonesia, and Pakistan follow largely the same conceptual path. Next slide, please. Such is the context in which I intervene to write about Islam as critique. Like Nietzsche's notion of philosophizing with a hammer, I contest the self-congratulatory story of the Enlightenment to demonstrate how critique works in Islamic tradition. Drawing on Talal Asad and others, the book undoes the polarity between the religious and the secular. To think of critique and reflexivity, and this is the common tendency, as solely the property of the Enlightenment is a mistake. critique precedes the Enlightenment and is traceable to the Axial Age, which historians roughly date from 800 to 200 BC. Now, if we take this framework, then it is possible to see Gautam Buddha as a critique. He contested the foundation of the hierarchical social order of his time, which was sanctioned by the religious logic of jati or caste. Now, from this framework, likewise, the Prophet Moses and Jesus, they were also critiques of their own time. And so was Prophet Muhammad, who stands in the tradition of Moses and Jesus. So in Quranic terms, the mission of all prophet that Allah sent was to do reform, Islah. And to reform was to critique. Now, this mission of reform resonated with that of Talmud and the Bible. The prophets of Bani Israel strove to reform societies of their time by criticizing the power of the power that be. Seen from this lens, Prophet Muhammad was a prominent critic of the Meccan social order. He devoted himself to reforming the society whose power elites hated him. Yet he did not disown Meccans. Forced to leave Mecca on his return, he forgave even those who had planned to kill him. Such was Muhammad's love to the people of Mecca he aimed to reform and critique. So the mission of reform and renewal, which is tasdeed of God's message after Muhammad's death, lay with ulama regarded as heirs to the Prophet. The correct translation of ulama is a scholar, not clerics, as it is usually done. Before I summarize the main argument of the book, let me say about the subject matter. The subject of critique this book tracks is the exposition on Islam by Abul Ala Maududi, the founder of Jamaat Islami in colonial India. It discusses multifaceted critiques of his exposition by former members and sympathizers of Jamaat and its student wing. It describes forms, modalities, and mechanism of critique exemplified by Muslims in their engagement, for instance, on issues of gender equality and the state. Along the way, it discusses in the context of India, such issues as democracy, justice, language, identity, and so on. The data in the book also show how diverse mode of critique pertain to power and powerlessness and relate as much to the real world as to the possible world. The final slide. So the book makes actually 4 theses, and that is where I want to end. So the first one is that against the consensual view that Islam lacks reason and it is not modern yet, it argues that in different forms and degrees, critique has been integral to Islam. The point is how to understand and unpack it. The Enlightenment idea of critique is product of a highly local social formation, the generalization of which has limited efficacy in other contexts. The Enlightenment, which is deemed as the reference point for reason and critique, in my view, was actually an ethnic project because Europe constituted its identity in the name of reason against a series of others, including Islam. The second thesis is in and of itself, reason is neither sufficient nor autonomous in arriving at judgment. Left to itself, in many ways, reason is helpless to explain the first principle any tradition or worldview, including the secular one, presupposes. In other words, reason is enmeshed in culture, tradition, and politics. The third thesis I make is that in Islam, reason, which is aql, is highly valued. However, rather than being antithetical to emotion and affect, it coexists with Islamic notion of qalb or dil, heart. As Abul Kalam Azad, one of the mufassir of the Quran, argued that Quran at once addresses the heart and dimag, mind of its reader. In both Arabic and Urdu tradition, the locus of intellect is not mind, it is heart, qalb. Finally, the book makes a strong case for extending the idea of critique from the domain of the elite to ordinary subjects. It contends that non-intellectuals like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and tens of thousands of his followers of his anti-colonial movement called Khudai Khidmatgar, they also enacted and participated in critique. It also focuses on South Asian proverbs as arenas of critique in everyday life. So my conceptualization of critique thus departs from a long established Western tradition which limits critique simply to literary text and canons. To argue for critique in everyday life as a cultural practice is not, however, to suggest that ordinary subjects and a specialist, which is, intellectuals with PhD, for instance, are critics of the same type or kind. When Gramsci observed that everyone was an intellectual, he also remarked that all of us could and often made omelettes, but all of us were not necessarily master chef. So critique then is not confined to intellectuals nor to text. Put differently, the book restores critique where it rightfully belongs, namely life intertwined with death. So returning to Sloterdijk, with whom I began, despite the existence of Life Insurance Corporation, the largest insurance company owned by the Indian state, religion continues to be salient in India as well as outside India. And contra both Sloterdijk and Edward Said, religion has unnoticed potential, resources, creativity, which the Enlightenment unjustifiably stigmatized. So the book foregrounds and evidentially demonstrates this larger thesis. So that is where I'll stop.
Over to you, Shaheen. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Irfan. It was short at the same time. It was a brilliant exposition of your book. So I'll start off with a few questions and then we'll jump into the participants' questions. So my first question, actually, some of the questions actually a doubt actually. In your book, you're trying to establish, or you successfully establish an anthropology of critique outside of Christianity and Europe. So how is such a form of critique different from a critique emanating from within Europe or Christianity? How do the two differ?
Okay, that is a great question, and it requires a long discussion, but let me try to sort of pin it down. As I have understood, I think, of course, Western philosophy, and I mean the modern philosophy and Western thoughts in modern times, it is highly complex. It is highly complex. But if one is to identify one key mechanism, then I think it is this notion or the idea of dualism pervades Western modern thoughts throughout. Now, connected to this idea of dualism, I also sense that there is also a loss of balance. Now, what I mean by loss of balance, probably the Islamic idea of, or the Urdu, I think it is probably also an Arabic word called tawazun. So that tawazun is not often maintained. What I mean by this is the following, that there was a time, for example, when people would say that, well, everything has got to be based on reason. As you know, in the last 15, 20 years, there is a lot of scholarly interest in emotion and affect. And it seems like there are more people now, at least in anthropology and sociology, who are more interested in, at least in academic context, in affect and emotion. So what I mean by this loss of balance is that at one point of time, everything becomes centered around reason. At another point, everything becomes all about affect and emotion. So that is one aspect of the modern Western thought. One has to also see it, and this directly stems from my argument that if ideas or philosophy is not simply an exercise of the mind, then we have to also see what were the social political formation in which the modern Western thoughts emerged. Of course, the context is colonial expansion, imperial domination, although in many of these intellectual writings, these words are not used. Often they say it is like the age of exploration, the age of discovery. But these are all words which basically mean that colonial expansion and imperial domination. And that is where I think if philosophy is not simply a mental exercise, then Western political thought, including the cultural thought, it emerged as project of security. I'm also, although the book doesn't use this term, but the idea of geophilosophy. So Deleuze and Guattari, they have come up with this idea of geophilosophy. So much of the Western political thought, or at least the dominant ones, they are also part of this geophilosophy, or as a project of security or securitization more properly. Now you contrast this with the Islamic thinking, and of course, one may say that I'm sort of reifying, but I'm reifying it just to make a point. So as I see it, I think, in Islamic tradition and thought, it is not marked by dualism, but it is a sort of non-dualism. And one example would be that this sharp separation between heart and mind, that doesn't actually operate in Islamic tradition, because as you see, Quran appeals both to the heart as well as the mind. In fact, in the Islamic tradition, and this was even in the case of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who is considered as one of the greatest modernists, that he would also appeal to the heart. And the idea that aql resides within heart, or at least it is not disconnected from the heart, So I think it is this non-dualism which is important in the Islamic thought. And finally, I also think that a sense of morality, because one of the things which one notices in the modern Western thought is that, of course, there is so-called secularized version of morality, which is considered as ethics. But in either case, what you see here is that I'm not saying that ethics and morality, they disappeared, but they become subservient to interest. Okay? Now, if we take it in terms of political formation, at least from 19th century onwards, national interest becomes the overriding thing. And the question of morality and ethics, they don't disappear, but they become at best secondary. So I think these would be some of the ways in which one can see the distinction of the Western thoughts, and also how Islamic thought is different. Of course, there would be some qualification in whatever I have said, but on a general level, I think this is how I see it.
Okay, thank you, Professor Irfan. We have questions coming in the chat as well. Before we get into that, I'll have just two more questions. So I'll ask two questions together, and we'll get on to the questions from the participants. So one question, what I have in mind is that, taking on from what you explained right now, you were talking about the Western philosophical intellectual tradition of critique. Could you identify a similar strain? You did refer to Raja Ram Mohan Roy and also Amartya Sen in your work. So is there a distinct Indian philosophical tradition in the same way they see Muslims and Islam like the Western philosophical tradition?
Is there something distinctive about Indian philosophy?
Yeah, in the way they see Muslims and Islam.
And by Indian, you mean the Hindu philosophy, or?
Yeah, Hindu philosophy, basically, because the remaining would be same as a Eurocentric philosophy as well. Yeah. There's a question I got asked in the chat. That's what.
Yeah. Look, I've not studied the Indian philosophy in the same way that I have studied the Islamic tradition. So I cannot say with much authority, but some of the secondary sources that I have read and some of the friends who do philosophy, their impression is also that actually in Vedantic philosophy, they say that, well, or if there is one key thing in Hindu philosophy, at least in its modern interpretation, you know, so their argument is also that it is non-dualism is the overriding thing of Hindu philosophy. But my sense is, especially in the hands of people like Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, who is considered as one of the major interpreter of Hindu philosophy. This non-dualism, I think, if you relate it to Islam or the modern Hindu philosophy's take about Indian Islam, in my view, it has a strong assimilative dimension, which is to say that rather than recognize the autonomy of Islamic thought, it subordinates, or it tries to assimilate within its own predetermined framework. But in short, I think I am not probably the right person to answer this question.
Okay. Now, one more question, the last question I have, and before we give it off to the question from the chat, is that in chapter 2 of your book, you start off with a very provocative statement by saying that we have to move away from the tradition of modern writings. And also title is Enlightenment as Ethnicity. So it will be quite provocative for many. So in this sense, at the same time, we have an emerging discipline of decoloniality. So would you consider your work as belonging to that emerging scholarship of decoloniality in its critique of Eurocentrism?
Yeah, so in this particular book, I don't deal with decolonial thought or decoloniality per se, but I would say that in terms of its spirit, of course, it informs without using that term. Uh, and the way I see it is primarily in the following way, that in order for non-Western thoughts to have a sense of autonomy, so this whole project of mimicry and copying, that has to go. And as you know, when Jalal Ahmad used that word called Westoxication, his whole point was that, you know, it leads to this whole project of imitation also leads to your own loss of self, right? So in that sense, I think there would be common ground. Having said that, I also find that the term, so my point is not about the project per se, which I'm very sympathetic to, but I think the term decolonial itself is a largely negative referent. Now, I would be more interested in putting forward a positive framework. So rather than decolonizing, what is it that we are aiming for? Like, what is the positive pursuit? Now, in my view, I think if you speak about Islamic tradition, so as you know, tahrir, which is writing, tahrir as a piece of writing, or even, for example, a letter is called tahrir. It is connected to hurriya, or in Urdu, hurriyat. And therefore, we have something like tahrir esquire, which is freedom. So I think, and I'm putting forward this as an idea to all those people who are interested in decoloniality, that can we give it a more positive push, that, okay, it is also for freedom. And I think an act of writing which is geared towards or leads to hurriya, and accordingly we do our writing for that purpose, that would be something quite different. The other thing which I wanted to say about, or which comes to my mind about decoloniality as a term, it is a very generic term, and it doesn't take into account, for example, we have to be very careful about it, that we had very different forms of colonialism. So in a scholarly literature, in sociology and elsewhere, so for example, the Spanish colonialism, or the colonization of Australia, America, and the Latin America, in sociological literature, it is called replicative destructive. So the entire society was sort of destroyed, and linguistic cultural imposition is complete. Okay, French colonialism is assimilative. So you see all the places where French colonies were established, you see at least the entire elites is the entire set of elites, they subscribe to, or they speak, or in some cases they can only speak in French.
Francophiles, yeah.
The Dutch, so if you look at the Dutch colonialism in Indonesia, you don't see the elites speaking Dutch. There were few, you know, in the beginning, but you don't see in the same way. So likewise, you know, there is sort of, you know, Belgian form of colonialism and all that. So this larger term called decoloniality is useful, but I think one needs to also go into the specifics and see how these different forms of colonialism have worked. And it is, I think, in identifying those specificity of colonial forms of knowledge, colonial forms of domination, that a more solid and robust blueprint can be drawn to make decoloniality as a robust project.
Okay, thank you, Professor Irfan. Now, there's a question from Aisha Saeed. I'll read out the question. The question is, according to Allama Iqbal in his reconstruction, intellect is a lower form of thought, intuition being a higher form. He talks about a synthesis of all sources of knowledge. So, and they're asking your comment on that. That's particularly the question, actually.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, Iqbal is very much present in the book. And this specific point that this participant has raised, I think I discuss it right in the prologue. So for Iqbal, Wijdan, and that is an Arabic Urdu term. For him, Wijdan also has a very powerful presence in terms of recognition, in terms of thinking about yourself, as well as knowledge. So, yeah, I think it is quite right to say that aql in itself, and that is my whole point. And I also relate it to Shah Waliullah. So his entire reflection in the precinct of the Kaaba is precisely about this non-dualism. So where aql is not opposed to wijdan, and they operate in a as an ensemble. So not as polar opposites or one canceling another or the other, but they form a constitutive whole in which all these intuition, wijdan, aql, and dream, they all have their equal place. Of course, it matters a lot which one at which point, or it depends upon the person who is making the interpretation, how to relate them in a convincing and analytically coherent way. So I would say that yes, Iqbal in that sense was against that kind of dualism, which has become dominant not only in the Western thoughts, but you can also see the modernist in the colonized world. They also replayed that kind of dualism. Either it has to be, reason, or, everything is reason. And one of the, of course, most vulgar and at the same time most popular example of that would be Salman Rushdie.
Okay. So we have the next question is from Dr. Said Mustafa. And his question is, where and how do you see power in relation to the ethical, moral orientation of Islamic critique?
That is a very general kind of question, and can Syed make specify it more?
Yeah, I think, is it possible to unmute Mizan so they can ask a specific question?
Yes, I will unmute Sayed. I'm just going to check him on the list. There we go. Sayed, Bismillah. Sayed, are you there? Hello? Sayed, are you there? Can you be more specific in your question, or do you want to elaborate? Yeah, Bismillah, go ahead. Yeah.
Voice is not muted, I guess. If he's muted?
No, I've unmuted it, so he should be. I think it's your speaker's not working.
We can't hear you.
We can't hear you. Okay. Okay, so whilst we wait, should we just go to another question on the chat?
Yeah, I'll go to another question.
It's from Hasim.
Hasim, yeah.
Yeah.
So Hasim's question is, Omar Ranjum, in one of his article titled "Do Islamists Have an Intellectual Deficit?" argues that Islamists lack discursive depth due to disconnect with tradition. Since your book situates Moidunny differently, as the one who continues a tradition of critique, how do you comment on this?
Well, I mean, this too is sort of very generic question. But since probably we will have, I mean, I would have, if it was face to face, I would have liked to have some follow-up. But probably in this format, I think it is not advisable. But let me address it to the extent that I've understood the question correctly. Now, if Anjum is saying this, of course, I think one has to also see not Islamist as a too generalizing category, that Islamist everywhere in all the times. I think that empirically would be hard to sustain it, because we also have different kinds of Islamists. So there are some who are actually well versed and rooted in the tradition. There are others who are not. And once we specify this, then probably we can get to the kernel of the question. Now, of course, coming to the specifics of Moidunny, yeah, he is rooted in the tradition, but at the same time, then I think you have to see how different people have reacted to him. There are people who think that actually this guy is not, it is not part of tradition, you know. There are others who see it very differently. And as you know, in the subcontinent, if you take, for example, Iqbal, the traditional ulama, not all of them, but many of them, they would not, initially at least, they would sort of dismiss Iqbal by saying that he is not a product of the tradition in the same way, like he didn't go to a madrasa and so on and so forth. So in the case of Moidunny, of course, one has to see how different people have reacted to it, and I don't think there is a consensus, so to speak, that difference still exists. So I think for me the question would be not so much that one particular category is removed from the discursive tradition and another set of people are completely enmeshed in, but a more interesting question would be the extent to which they relate or they don't relate, and then also see by their engagement or non-engagement, what is it that they want to achieve, or what are the kind of questions that they want to address. Is it a productive way of doing it? And if we make our inquiries in that kind of direction, then I think it would be much more productive rather than putting it in terms of that, you know, one set of people have engaged and another set of people have not engaged with it, at least satisfactorily.
Should we get Sayyid Mustafa back? I think he's back online now. So let me just bring him back. If you can raise your hand, Sayyid, and I just need to see where you're. There's a function on Zoom where you can raise your hands. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to unmute you now. Okay, Bismillah, yeah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Jazakallah khair for giving me the opportunity to ask this question, and apologies for the earlier technical glitches. So the question is in relating to the entanglement of power with the ethical and the moral in the project that Dr. Irfan Ahmad is setting out for us here. I guess in order to kind of unpack and maybe zoom in on that question slightly more, I guess the question I'm asking really has to do with the order of priority. Because for some intellectuals, some theorists, if you like, critical theorists, cultural theorists, and otherwise, it's not entirely clear the relative order of priority of the ethical and the moral in relation to the political, vis-a-vis considerations of power. So for some, ultimately, power trumps ethics, and I think you've alluded to that during your talk. But I got the impression that you were taking us in the direction of ethical and moral restraints on power. But, you know, obviously since Nietzsche, onwards through Foucault and others, there's been a problematization of the ethical and the moral itself as inflected by power. So that's where I was going with this. I don't know if that helps clarify the issue.
Yeah, I think it gives me a sense of the direction in which you want the discussion to proceed, and I think it is a very useful way of thinking about it. Now, I guess, one could also think in terms of, like, once we pose it in terms of priority, then I would be interested in knowing more from Syed that, well, our conceptualization of power is also very different. And I think when Foucault speaks about power, or a lot of people, the Marxists and others, power, the assumption about power here is in terms of domination, in terms of exclusion, right? And ethics is generally considered as something which contests this idea of power, which is mostly construed in terms of domination, or let's say imposition of some kind. But my point would be that, can we, or especially from an Islamic perspective, can we also think of power in different terms? So power not as coterminous with domination and injustice, okay? And if we begin with that assumption, then it will also entail re-examining our assumption about ethics, because it appears to me that not in all, but in many cases, once we take power as and which is not to say that I don't see that much of the modern power is brutalizing, but at a conceptual level, if we begin to think of power from an Islamic framework, then this entire question about relationship between power and ethics, and also should we give priority to A over B or B over A, that will also get significantly reconfigured. Now, I'm not sure if this addresses Syed's question, but please feel free to interject.
Nothing comes to mind at this moment, Dr. Irfan, so Jazakallah khair for that response.
Okay, now we have another question again from Aisha Said. The question is quite short. It might require, again, an explanation of the question, but I'll put the question across. Are there any ethical limits to critique or any ethical code of conduct for it?
You see, one of the things which I've learned that the shortest questions, they're always the most difficult to answer.
Yeah, true.
Which is to say that, you know, you ask somebody, what is life? You know, and it takes a whole life to address that question. And one can still not be sure if that is the right answer. But let me say the following. In chapter 3, I distinguish Islamic idea of critique from those practices which are not approved by Islam. So one of the key things, and that I'm not sure in part that may also address what Syed had in mind, is that how do we distinguish condemnation from critique? You know, so I sort of gave a table which is like a tool to think with. So if we look at it from Islamic tradition perspective, so the terms which I use is like tanqeed in Urdu, you know, or not. So how tanqeed is different from tajheel? How tanqeed is different from takfir? How tanqeed is different from tazheek? So let me explain it for those who only know English. So tazheek is to mock at someone, you know. Takfir is to denounce somebody. Tajheel is to show somebody as ignorant. And takbir could be, it is like uncritical or undue glorification of someone. So if naqd or tanqeed, as I see it, is connected to the idea of islah, then these practices like tajheel, takfir, takbir, there is also something called takhfif. So if you want to criticize somebody, you sort of reduce this complex argument. Takhfif is like to distort or to shorten a complex argument to make it appear as the target of your critique, which you think is useful. So I think the key to all these the key to all such practices would be to keep at the center the idea of Islah. And once we have that framework, Islah, then these non-Islamic ideas of showing somebody as ignorant or or glorification of someone or takhfif, and in Urdu, of course, there's also tanqis, which is from noqs. Okay, so to find demerits in someone's thought or practices. So then we become very aware of those things. And precisely for that reason, I think this idea of Islamic notion of critique, once we distinguish it from un-Islamic practices, which I just summarized, then if the goal is Islah, you know, and it is Islah-e-Nafs as well as Islah-e-Muashra, so individual and society, or Islah-e-Zat or Islah-e-Samaji Islah, then the key question is not simply saying what you want to say, but also the manner in which you conduct Islah. So if you do it in a harsh way, or if you say it bluntly in a manner that the person who you want to direct your critical thought at doesn't feel comfortable, then the whole purpose of Islam is defeated. So in the book, I give one example, which is Hassan and Hussein, they go to masjid and see a very old person not doing his wudu, ablution correctly. And they want to tell the old person that actually this is not the correct way. So rather than saying that this is not the correct way of doing ablution, Hassan and Hussein asked the old person that, can you judge? We will do our wudu, and can you judge which one of the two has done it better? And then the old person sees and he remarks that, both of you did better than I did. So that is an Islamic way of doing Islah. And finally, I also want to say this because since I have taken this subject of critique beyond textual practices, so it is not simply back and forth of an argument in writing, but also a cultural practice which is connected to everyday life. Now, this example of Hassan and Hussein also is an illustration of something which you might call tanqeed by tamsil, which is to say that, or if you want to use the fashionable term, that it would be like embodied critique, which goes beyond verbal expression or textual writing, and it leads us squarely to the realm of practice.
And yeah, do you listen to me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you got a question from Hamza.
Yeah, we got a question from Hamza. We have around 15 minutes more, right, Mizan?
Yeah. 15
okay, we
minutes.
got 15. So we still have questions coming in. So the next question is Professor Irfan from Hamza. It's again, I think, a short question that will require a descriptive answer. So the question is, why did you choose Maududi more in your book, or the more emphasis on Maududi, and why not Sir Said Ahmad Khan, who in essence was more of acceptance of Western thought?
Yeah, well, I think, part of the answer would be that, I mean, one way to address this is that I would say, like, to make my theoretical framework, one could have chosen many sites. So even if I would have taken Sayyid Ahmad Khan, then some people might have asked me, but why didn't you take Muhammad Abdu? Why didn't you take Rashid Reda? Okay. And then, of course, theoretically, it is possible that there is one guy or one scholar who is well versed in all the linguistic resources, and he or she does discuss all of them. But since every intellectual work is also at the same time a recognition of the limits of a scholar, so the key point here is not why you took this one and why you didn't take others, but to use whatever I have done to develop a framework or to bring certain question to the forefront of academic debate. And this I did partly, and those of you who know, is also because I sort of had done my first book and PhD work on Moidunny. I was familiar with the literature. And I must say also that unlike the outside perception, when I was doing my doctoral fieldwork. And of course, as some of you know, this book is from the postdoctoral fieldwork. So I was in touch with Jamaat-e-Islami people, and some of you might be surprised to know that actually, of course, there were, all kinds of people within Jamaat. So there were people who would not be receptive to the critique of Moidunny, but there were also many people within Jamaat who actually told me that you must read this anti-Jamaat literature, and you cannot understand Jamaat unless you read the critique of Moidunny and so on and so forth. So much of this was also, it organically developed from my fieldwork and postdoctoral fieldwork later on. So finally, I think much of what we do is, of course, part of a conscious planning, but sometimes, and I think it is not simply applicable or true only for a scholarly work, but life in general, everything is not planned. Some things also happens, which you have not planned.
Okay. So we have a follow-up question from Hamza again. So it is regarding a critique of Amartya Sen's argumentative Indian. So the question that Hamza poses is that Amartya Sen's argumentative Indian, he makes an argument amongst many other things for the existence of a skeptical and even atheistic tradition of thought in ancient India.
Sorry?
Amartya Sen, he also makes for an argument for the existence of a skeptical and even atheistic tradition of thought in
atheistic.
Tradition of thought in ancient India. That's an endeavor which actually shares some common direction with your work, but Professor Ahmad faults it for his exclusion of Islam and its Hindu centrism. So is not Sen, just like yourself, trying to decenter the narrative of Western superiority by locating some of its ideas outside Europe centuries earlier? Even if the criticism of Islam's absence is invalid, one might have thought that the wider goal would have produced some fellow feeling. So I think it's to do with, the question is quite long, it's to do with your critique of Sen. At the same time, Sen himself is engaged in a critique of Eurocentrism in his work. So is there a commonality between your and Sen's work?
Yeah, so I not only with Sen, but I would be in support of other people who do want to decenter the West. But the point is, Sen does that to some extent, but he doesn't stop there. He also does something else, and that is where I want to say that. So, which is not to say that I'm against Amartya Sen in toto. I mean, to the extent that he has critiqued and he has done some positive contributions to economic thought, I would be with him. But of course, there is also difference, because the way Amartya Sen reads Adam Smith or the Scottish philosophy and the way I read it is completely different. He doesn't find much problem in Adam Smith. For him, he's a star of the kind of economic philosophy that Amartya Sen wants to put on the table. Whereas I see a deep kind of Islamophobia, I mean, not in the modern sense, but Adam Smith's hostility to Islam. And it is the same way. I didn't have time here to look at the Scottish Enlightenment, but it is the same kind of thing, Muhammad as the sign of fanaticism and so on and so forth. Now, when my question to Amartya Sen would be that if you have read Adam Smith, why don't you find this question problematic in Adam Smith? Okay, but more importantly, I think I'm not a fan of nationalism, whether it is Pakistani nationalism or Saudi, any nationalism. Amartya Sen is, in my view, or many of his statements. So I think in present time, a critique of Eurocentrism is fine, but are you also a critique of nationalism? Or especially the kind of nationalism that we have in India. So you remember Amartya Sen saying at one point of time that he described caste as anti-national, if you have caste violence. But my question to Amartya Sen would be that if there is violence in the name of religion, okay, is Amartya Sen going to say that religion is against nation? Because when he said that caste is anti-national, he is assuming the idea of a Hindu society and Hindu nation, and therefore it is anti-national. But in the case of other events, he doesn't say that. So anyway, to summarize, I think I would go with him to the extent that he critiques Eurocentrism, but on the grounds of on the ground on which I explained, I would also depart from him.
Okay. So we have around a couple of minutes left. Mizan, do you mind if I ask a question of my own?
Your show, bro. Bismillah.
Okay. So as Moidunny, and you did mention the link to your previous book, that is Islamism and Democracy in India. So in Islamism and Democracy in India, you look at the transformation of Jamaat Islami. And now in the second book, you talk about critique, questioning Moidunny as well. So do you think, from your view and your study, that the transformation itself is a way of self-critique, that the Islamic movement in India, the way they transformed from what they were in the 40s and 50s to what it is now, which are quite detailed in your book, is that also a way of critique? And the critique, is it from an Islamic way of critique, internal?
Yeah, so one way to address this is, like, some of you who might have read the epilogue of the book. So one of the key points that I make, especially in a lot of these intellectual discourses, now, and this is a larger philosophical question, which is that where does thought belong?
Mm-hmm.
So do thoughts emerge here? So is it like, one fine morning, when it is not Ramadan, you wake up in the morning, you have a cup of coffee, and suddenly this realization dawns on you, and then you start doing things. So what I'm saying is this complex relationship between thought and practice. Okay. And again, the more fruitful way is to look at them in a dialectical way, rather than saying that, well, you have ideas first and then that leads to praxis, or it is praxis which generates idea,
Mm-hmm.
So if you see, and this is one of the works that I like, Michael Trullo. So when he was writing about revolution in Haiti,
Mm-hmm.
so one key question would be like, is it that these French philosophers, they woke up one fine morning and had coffee, and then they said that, well, let's have equality, fraternity, and liberty? No, it is not that. It was these slaves on plantation land, and you had the French colonial authorities having their clerks on the plantation. And these words of liberty, equality, and fraternity were first uttered by these slaves. And these manuals were shipped to Paris in terms of journal. And then these scholars would read it. So the ideas, it is not like, they emerge from your head. Anyway, before you think that I'm not directly answering your question, what I want to say here is that critique not simply as a set of ideas which emerge in someone's head who is uniquely gifted and so on, but if we relate it to as a social practice, as a cultural practice, then this trajectory of Jamaat in terms of its transformation, you know, and now in hindsight, if you look at it, some of these things were said actually just at the time of partition itself, especially by one guy called Shahid, Shahid or Imam, some Ram Nagri. His last name is Ram Nagri. I'm forgetting it is Shahid or Imam. So a lot of this, which began to take place in 70s and 80s, this Mr. Ram Nagri had already anticipated, you know. So yes, I think the critique and the transformation, or one could likewise speak of transformative critique and critical transformation. So in fact, if you take the notion of Islam, so Islam would be to change, right? And change, of course, it also leads to a lot of conceptual problem. And I think I'm sort of, and the notion of Islam is very important, because if you remember, Naim Siddiqui and people like him, when they began to write the biography of Prophet Muhammad, probably on the first 2 pages itself, he would describe Prophet Muhammad as leader of a revolution, inqilab. Now, there is not an Islamic idea, but of course it is informed by, this is my conjecture, but others can correct me. I think probably it wouldn't be easy to find Prophet described as leader of inqilab in 17th or 18th century, you know. So this idea of Islam, so in that sense, it is connected to change and critique and change, or to put it other way, like critical transformation and transformative critique would be linked to this idea of Islam, which is part of the Islamic tradition.
Okay, so we have a few more questions, and one question is again, both the questions are to do with the personalities of figures in the book or the lack of absence of them. So one,
sorry, which figure?
One question is continuing from your critique of Amartya Sen. Do you feel the same way about Arundhati Roy? That is one question. And the second question is again, your highlighting of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and Maulana Abul Kalam Azad also in the book, the emphasis.
So the first one is Arundhati Roy, then Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, right?
Yeah, and Abul Kalam Azad.
So about Arundhati Roy, I understood how do I see Arundhati Roy in the same way as Amartya Sen?
Yeah, that, yeah.
And what about Abdul Ghaffar Khan?
That is, the second question is from Salma. So the question is, why did you highlight Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan?
Oh, okay.
And Maulana Abul Kalam Azad also in the book. Why did you include them in the book?
Yeah, so let me address in that order. I think, you know, Arundhati Roy, there is sort of significant difference. Amartya Sen, he does engage with Hinduism, which is to say that he does engage with Hinduism as a scholarly practice. And if I maybe, I'm not sure whether it is from his father's side or from his mother's side, but his grandfather was a very noted scholar of Hinduism. Now, the point is, whether I agree or disagree with him, that is a different thing, but he engages with a scholarly tradition of Hinduism. To the extent that I know Arundhati Roy, she's not a scholar of religion to the extent that I have read. So she would not be engaging with whatever she calls it, insurgent thoughts or rebellious practices in terms of religion per se, you know. So in that sense, she is different. But at another level, I think there is a commonality between Amartya Sen and Arundhati Roy. So in the Algebra of Warfare and Welfare, I've critiqued Arundhati Roy. And that is this, what I would consider a very bogus idea of Indian nationalism, where they want to equalize so-called Hindu communalism and Muslim communalism, and they put it on the same plane. So Arundhati Roy, in at one place I do say that she made a statement in which she says that, well, a student Islamic movement of India, SIMI, and Bajrang Dal, they mirror each other or something like that. That to me is a very dangerous way of thinking. So even though she might be very radical at one level, this process of equalizing SIMI and Bajrang Dal, not only it ignores the gigantic power asymmetry between the two groups, but it also in a way legitimizes the majoritarian violence, but more importantly, the nationalist assumption, you know. Now, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, yeah, so the reason why I stress him, so if you see, the book sort of, you know, it travels unevenly. The reason why I chose Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan is, like, if you think of Iqbal, if you think of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, if you think of Abul Kalam Azad, so, and these are just some examples, all these three names that I've taken, these are the people who are considered as a scholar, okay, intellectuals. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan is not considered as an intellectual. I mean, he did have educational degree, but he was considered more an activist. And my whole point was that if we, as I said, like, you know, critique is not simply a mental or intellectual exercise. If it is a social and cultural practice, then we must see it how it is done by non-intellectuals, quote unquote. So so that was one reason. And the second one is also because I thought, you know, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan has been sidelined hugely in the understanding of Islam. Whenever he is talked about as a frontier Gandhi. So his identity in his own right doesn't exist. He is simply an appendage to Gandhi. And his idea of non-violence was very important. And let us also note the fact that in the 1930s, when Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was enacting this mass movement, it was one of the poorest areas. The literacy rate was less than 4%. So how these unlettered people and those who are not intellectual, how do they practice critique, you know? So even though Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan himself was not an intellectual, he was a disciple of Shaykhul Hind. He was in touch with Deoband ulama, including Ubaidullah Sindhi, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to see this idea and the work of critique. And some of you know, he also initially he started his movement from mosque, and his call was also of Islah, you know. So that is the reason I chose to focus on Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan.
Okay. So Mizan, do we have time for more, or is the time up?
I think we've taken up a lot of the professor's time. I think we've got lots of questions coming through. I think the most important thing would be people to purchase the book, right? Purchase the book, and then if they want to get in contact with him, they can directly and email him. Any final thoughts that would like to wrap up? Yeah, from the professor. Yeah.
Yeah, just want to inform that the work which you mentioned of Arundhati Roy and mirroring Simi and Bajrang Dal, it is her book, The Shape of the Beast, actually, collection of interviews. Yeah. So, Professor Ahmad, before we wind off, any final thoughts, comments?
So I just want to thank you all for having this event, and in the strange time that we live, and good to have this discussion and interact with you. So yeah, a big thank you to both Shaheen and Mizan, but also all those people who took part in it.
Thank you so much. And Shaheen, any final thoughts before I hand over to myself and then close out?
Alhamdulillah, it was interesting, and the questions were interesting, and I'm sure that it was interest of time, or else we would have got more questions. I, in fact, had my own more questions to ask, so inshallah later on, another opportunity. So thank you, Mizan, and also for all those who have signed in. Islamic courses do these periodic academic and intellectually intensive debates and discussions. So you can check up their Facebook links and page to see what is next. I think Mizan will inform on that as well.
Sure.
So thank you, Mizan, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Ahmad, a lot. And assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much. And once again, thank you to Dr. Ahmed and to Shaheen for being a great host, and Dr. Ahmed for fascinating talk about the book. And hopefully that will raise interest. We'd like to invite you back for more interesting perspectives on Islamic in India, if that's okay, if you can give us ijazah for us to invite you back, Dr. Ahmed. Is that okay? Because we've got lots of
Sure.
interesting discussions and debates to talk about because we've got nearly 500 million people, and we really haven't had real discussions about the Islamic in India, the state of it now. What's happening in Pakistan, what's happening in India, in particularly right now, with the rise of the BJP, and obviously what's happening in Bangladesh. So we need to have these important debates and discussions, and what are the philosophies and ideas coming, especially from the BJP, who are in power right now, and their criticisms of the Muslims as well, and internal Muslim criticism. And someone like yourself is better placed than most others, because obviously you're from there and you've written a lot about that. And that was very interesting about your comment about Ahmad Sen, who I've studied with as well. It just interesting.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm at the LSE, and at the same time,
was it at Trinity College or something?
No, it was at the LSE,
okay.
LSE economics. But it's interesting your perspectives on Arundhati Roy. I didn't realize, the positioning. It was very interesting. First time I'm hearing of this. But thank you so much. This is going to be another discussion for another time. Another time, inshallah. Once again, folks, just leave your email address if you'd like to. If you're not already on our mailing list, please leave your email address, and we'll send you a copy of the recording. And please watch out for our next sessions. Tomorrow is with Idris Khamisa and Ibrahim Rasool on leadership. And on Friday, we have Professor Mustafa Abu Sway from Jerusalem. On Saturday, we have Abd Hakim Murad. And on Sunday, we will have Wael Halak. He's going to be talking about Taha Abdurrahman, his thoughts and reflections on his books of Taha Abdurrahman. And then on Monday, we will have Ziauddin Saddar on his recent book on Islamization to new ways of knowledge. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank everyone. Take care. Make dua for us in these final 10 nights of Ramadan, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, Mizan. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.